Hey people, my name is Suede, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial on the governments in Civ 3. So first, I thought it'd be a good idea to explain the concepts that appear in the government screen when you go to the Civlopedia, just so you know what they mean. Worker efficiency is worker speed. So in fascism, that's 200%. That means you work twice as fast as despotism, where the worker speed is 100%. Pretty simple. War weariness is how unhappy your civ becomes when you're at war, and these are conflict-heavy wars. So if you're just in a war where you're on two different islands and you and the other civ don't actually fight, then you're not going to have issues with war weariness, even if you're in democracy, for example. But if you're in a grueling war where you're using a lot of units and taking a lot of cities and losing a lot of cities and being pillaged a lot, then you're going to have a lot of war weariness problems. So draft rate, that's how many units you can draft per turn, and military police is the maximum content faces from having military units in your city. So if your military police limit is 2, then the first 2 warriors you have, or any military unit that you have in a city, will produce 1 happy face each. If you have any units beyond that, they will not produce any happy faces. Great. Unit support. This is a little bit harder, but it's pretty simple when you think about it. So, per town, per city, and per metropolis. So let's look at an example of this. You can pause if you want to look into more detail. Let's say you have 2 towns and 1 city. That means you get 4 per town, so that's 8, and then 1 city gives you another 4, so that's 12. That means your military, your unit support cap is 12. So if the number of units that you have in your empire exceeds the cap, so it exceeds 12, then you have to pay gold per turn to maintain those units. So let's say you have 20 units, then you have to pay 8 gold per turn per unit per turn, assuming that the support cost is 1. So in a republic, for example, the unit support cost is 2. So if you're 10 units over the unit cap, you have to pay 20 gold per turn. Great. So let's talk about the governments and how they actually work. So anarchy is your transitional government. This means if you switch, you start in despotism. If you switch to something else, you have to go through anarchy to get to the other government. It lasts between 2 and 8 turns. It's always 2 for religious civs, at least human-controlled religious civs. And if you're non-religious, it's partly based on luck and partly based on the size of your empire. If your empire is really big, then it's going to be between 4 and 8 turns. If your empire is really small, let's say it's only 1 city, it's going to be between 2 and 6 turns. That's the same number of turns for accelerated production and non-accelerated production, by the way. So that actually makes quite a bit of difference. You produce nothing, you get no commerce and no military police. But food is still in play. So ideally, you want to micromanage your citizens towards food-heavy tiles so that your cities can still grow at least while you're in anarchy. Although in practice, that isn't really usually very possible. And the reason for that is unhappiness, because 2 of your main ways of getting happiness have just been taken out from you, because you have no commerce, so that means you can't be spending anything on the happiness slider, so you lose all that happiness, and then you have no military police too. So it's likely that you might have your cities rioting. And to do that, to fix that, you have to convert them to entertainers. If you convert them to entertainers, the city might actually starve. But yeah, it's just something you have to kind of live with. The one thing is to make sure that you take those entertainers and you assign them to this tiles once you switch into the correct form of government. Because let's say you switch into monarchy, you suddenly have military police, so you get those happy faces. And if you're using the happiness slider, you get happiness from that because you're getting commerce again. So with that extra happiness, you don't need those entertainers anymore. So assign them to the tiles so you can get the yields from those tiles. Workers work at half speed. There's ways to minimize this. I'm not going to get too much into the technicalities of it, but one, for example, is that even though your workers work at half speed, they travel at the same speed. So right before you switch out of anarchy, it might be a good idea if you have worker moves on that turn to move your workers onto tiles that you haven't worked before, because you're going to have to walk to those tiles anyway, eventually, and you walk just as fast in anarchy as in any other form of government. So despotism. This is the government you start in. It's got pretty good stats across the board. Let's look at them one by one. No war weariness, that's a big thing. Draft weariness, whatever. You get military police. You get really solid unit support, and it's only 1 cost per unit per turn. if you exceed the cap. So it's okay. It's not catastrophic if you exceed the cap. So you might be wondering, what's wrong with this government? And there's two things. The first is corruption and waste. It's rampant. Although corruption and waste from government types isn't that big of a deal. Like it's not ideal, obviously, to be in despotism because of the corruption and waste, but it doesn't cause too much of a problem. Like it's a marginal effect. So with that, you might be wondering, what's the issue here? Like, going through anarchy sucks, as we've just talked about. Why should we even switch? And the reason for that is the despotism penalty. That's this right here. And if you're not familiar with the despotism penalty, pause the video right now and read this and memorize it, because it is a very important fact of the game. So, any city that produces more than 2 food, shields, or commerce and from any tile produces 1 less instead from that tile. So that applies to despotism and anarchy. And it is really bad, and you really want to avoid it if possible. That means switching into any other form of government, because all other form of governments, except anarchy and despotism, have no despotism penalty. So examples of tiles that the despotism penalty hurts are any mined hill or mountain. Those should produce 3 shields. They only produce 2 in despotism. River tiles with any other commerce bonus. So let's say the river with a tobacco on it. When you road that tile, it should produce 3 commerce minimum, but you lose one of those commerces to being in despotism. Cows, deers, wheats, floodplains, those will all cost you 1 food when you're in despotism, because those tiles have 3 food minimum as a base. It also means that you gain nothing from irrigating grassland in most cases, which really makes it difficult to grow. This is a problem, especially if you're automating your workers, because the AI doesn't know not to automate workers to irrigate grassland in despotism. It doesn't know that the irrigation does nothing in despotism. It also affects the agricultural trait bonus. Just like you get the bonus food in your city square, even if you don't have access to fresh water when you're outside of despotism. In despotism, you only get that bonus when your city is next to fresh water. It's a weird interaction, but whatever. Yeah, so here's a tangent. Why new players struggle with unit support. So the first thing is they don't plant enough towns. Often they expand their borders really big with culture, but then they don't fill in that space with towns, and so they aren't using the tiles there. Which means relative to the size of their nation, they get little unit support, because as we've established, unit support comes from your cities. They don't plant next to fresh water. This is an issue in monarchy and republic and other governments like that, where you need to be above size 6, above population 6, to get extra unit support, meaning that if you don't plant next to fresh water, it can be difficult to grow past size 6, meaning you don't get that extra unit support. The third reason, this is a really big one, is that their cities stall in growth due to using entertainers. So when you assign a citizen to be an entertainer, it's not working the land, it's not working the tiles that would produce food otherwise, so that will really stall your growth. This means that if your cities aren't growing, then they're not going to be past size 6, and so you don't get like the bonus. For example, in Republic, you get 3 from being in a city, you get 1 from being a town. So in terms of unit support, it's very key to be growing your cities past size 6, but if you're using entertainers, you can't do that. And that's the reason new players use entertainers, is mostly because they don't know the better ways of getting happiness. So either they don't understand how military police work, and they're not using the happiness slider. The happiness slider is a really, really big deal. And the fourth thing is they don't disband excess units. So this means if you're over the unit cap, you should be aware of the fact that you're over the unit cap. And sometimes it is totally worth it to be over the unit cap. If you need those units for something, great. If it's worth paying the gold per turn, then do it. Just don't have a bunch of warriors sitting around doing nothing, just eating up like dozens of gold per turn if you don't need them, you know? So, now that we've talked about that, we can talk about why monarchy is a much easier form of government than republic, even though republic is the most amazing government in the world. So, the reason for that is you get a solid amount of unit support, and you only pay 1 per turn in unit cost. So, you might have some issues with unit support, but it's not going to be disastrous if you're over the cap. There's no despotism penalty, of course, which is great. There's marginally less corruption and waste than despotism, also good. There's no war weariness. Easy mode. Generally, I find that the pay citizens hurry production method is easier for players to use than the forced labor. There are many situations where forced labor is absolutely great, but it requires more technical knowledge about how to use it. And yeah, so if you're a new player, definitely recommend this government. If you're a more experienced player, like you can manage unit support and war weariness, but you think you're going to be fighting in a lot of wars, this is still probably maybe the better government for you. Republic. So the commerce bonus here is absolutely insane. It's 1 commerce in any tile that is producing at least 1 already. So pretty much what that means is if you have 10 cities with each 10 citizens in them, that would be like 110 extra commerce, because you get it from the city square too. Generally, some of that's going to be wasted to corruption, but still, that's a really, really big deal. The other thing here is that in addition to that flat extra gold, it also gets affected by the multipliers from things like libraries and marketplaces. This makes them more efficient. Unit support is an issue here, though. So it is you get 1 per unit per town, 3 per city, and then 4 per metropolis. But if you exceed the unit cap, then you have to pay 2 per unit per turn. That makes it really, really important to disband those extra units. One thing that if you want to be good at Republic, you have to learn is not all of your cities need to be protected. There's no military police in Republic. You're not getting any happy faces from having them in your cities. So if you got cities in like the core of your empire, they don't need defensive units in them. If you're on an island, for example, you might not need any defensive units. If you just have like 5 or 6 knights that can like handle any landing force that an enemy could possibly drop on you, then you might not need any defenses at all. Definitely look for as many ways as possible to cut back on the number of units you have, except for having less workers, because workers do count toward the unit cap, but you do want to have workers, obviously. Yeah, you get no military police. Another thing is it's really, really, really important to grow to size 7 or beyond. In Monarchy, it's not quite as essential. In Republic, it's super essential, because not only do you get 3 times as much unit support from being size 7 or higher, you're also paying 2 gold per turn each time you're over the unit cap. And most of the time in Republic, you're going to be near the cap or over the cap, but you want to be only slightly over the cap, ideally. So, yeah. You can also engage in war as Republic. It's low war weariness, which is still significant. But if you do, you need to be quick, decisive, and efficient. Don't do long wars unless you're not actually fighting in those wars. Like, if you're like honoring a military alliance that you agreed to, but you're not actually fighting the enemy civ, then okay, you're not increasing your war weariness score, so you're not going to have any issues with war weariness. But if you're actually fighting, then keep the wars short. Feudalism. This government seemingly takes the worst element of monarchy and combines it with the worst element of republic. So from monarchy, you get the lack of the commerce bonus, and from republic, you get the war weariness. Because despite being what you'd think is like a militaristic government, it has low war weariness. So there is war weariness in this government. If you have a lot of towns, you can have a high military support cap. Just don't exceed that cap, otherwise it's disastrous. But of course, your ability to use those units is reduced by the war weariness, so this can cause issues. So why would you want to be in this government? I mean, the first thing is that it gets rid of the despotism penalty, at least, and it lowers the corruption very marginally relative to despotism. So you get a lot of those benefits, but you also get those benefits in monarchy, so why wouldn't you just be in monarchy? And one of the answers to that question is forced labor. At least that's the answer that I know. So there's a strategy that I use where I just build a lot of cities very densely together, and then I use hurry production to build a ton of swordsmen or trebuchets or whatever. And if you have a lot of luxury resources, then the forced labor method is actually superior to the pay citizen method. So yeah, by using that, you can fight short, decisive wars with a ton of units and win them and conquer the world. So that is my use for the government. I would not recommend this at all for new players. Democracy. So this also gives the commerce bonus, the same one as Republic. It doesn't really offer a lot the Republic doesn't. It gives you slightly faster workers, slightly less corruption, which is, yeah, that's not nothing, you know. And then unit support works differently. So you pay less per unit per turn if you exceed the cap, but the cap is 0. So you're always paying for any worker and military unit you have, 1 gold per turn. So this means if you had like 200 units, then okay, you're better off being in democracy than Republic in terms of war rate or in terms of unit support. Like you'd be paying less gold per turn in democracy. But if you have 200 units, you don't want to be in either of those governments. You want to be in something where you're not paying a ridiculous amount of gold. It's definitely preferable in some cases, but I doubt whether it's worth pursuing, you know? Because there's the opportunity cost in terms of the anarchy experience, and also the tech path. You spend a minimum of 8 turns researching printing press, and then researching democracy itself. And then you have to go through the anarchy. So, for example, the worker speed is good for building railroads faster, but if instead of researching democracy, you just went straight for steam power faster, you'd get the railroads faster anyway. So I think that would just be the better idea, just to do that. And in most cases, well, first of all, the war in readiness can be catastrophic if you end up in a war for whatever reason. And also just, it's a lot, generally, if you manage it well, you'll be paying less unit support in Republic. So I prefer Republic. If somebody told me they have an amazing strategy in democracy and I've got this all wrong, I'd probably believe them if they were a good player. But personally, I wouldn't recommend democracy over Republic. Communism. So I tested this out in my last game as Egypt, and the production was really, really strong. Like, if you have a lot of cities spread out across the map, then just you're going to net a lot of shields just by switching into this government. But of course, commerce is weak, because you're no longer receiving the commerce benefit that you get, like the bonus one you get in Republic or Democracy. Communism is strong compared to monarchy and feudalism, just because it has a lot of military police and a lot of unit support, and, well, forced labor is forced labor, you know, and the excess production you get from communal corruption or waste. But compared to Republican democracy, it can struggle. Just because you don't get that extra teching speed, you don't get that extra commerce. If you have a victory path set out for you, definitely I'd recommend this government. Like, if you're halfway to achieving world domination through conquest, definitely stick with communism. It just lets you grind to the end and really push to victory. But if you're in like a kind of situation where you need to continue teching to be able to win the game, then I wouldn't recommend it so much. You do get veteran spies in communism. It might help you if make up for like the slower teching by stealing enemy spies, but remember by stealing enemy techs, but using espionage costs gold, and you have less gold in communism, so yeah, it balances out. Fascism. This government is really, really, really bad. Unlike feudalism, unlike democracy, I can't imagine a situation where this would be worth switching into. I mean, at least communism gives a bonus to production. This gives nothing. Like, you get worker efficiency. This is really fast workers, but the problem with worker efficiency is by the time you get to any government that gives you worker efficiency, most of the worker jobs should be done by now. Like, you should have mines and roads and irrigation on every tile in your empire that's actually being used by your cities. So getting bonus worker efficiency in that stage of the game is not really useful. At the start of the game, like having the industrious trait is extremely useful, but by this stage of the game, not really useful. Hooray method is forced labor. Yeah. Unit support could, in theory, be higher than communism in some cases, but it's only really higher if you have a lot of high population cities. And one thing that fascism is bad at is having high population cities, because look at all this crap. Look at all these downsides to being in fascism, like losing population points. It's just garbage. Especially since if you're playing a militaristic style, you're probably going to be conquering a lot of cities and having them be low population. In which case, the communism unit support scheme, where you get 6 per town, is probably the better one. Why would you waste the turns required to switch into this? This is just, oh my god. Yeah. Culture flipping. Yeah, because you can't generate any culture until you assimilate a popular majority, you can have some issues with like capturing high population cities and having them, you can't like just rush out a temple really quick because the culture will do nothing until you get that popular majority in terms of culture. So yeah, really bad government. This is the only one in the game that I can't think of any scenario where you'd ever want to be in it. So yeah, those are my opinions of the different governments in Civ 3 and the related tips I have in regards to playing as them. I hope you guys enjoyed.